Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. Today for Fish and Wildlife, we're going to talk about the history of game and fish or the history of fish and wildlife. Um, just depends on the state what it's called, whether it's called game and fish or fish and wildlife or DNR or there's lots of names that the group of individuals who take after fisheries and game are called. It depends on the state. Okay, so I'm just gonna go through some of the highlights of the game and fish division or fish and wildlife, and then talk about some interesting individuals and the role that they might have played in kind of getting game and fish where it is today. And then finally, I'm going to end with careers in game and fish or fish and wildlife as they stand, kind of mm, you know in this time period. Uh, okay, so first, in 1849, um, there was legislation to adopt a law from England or a common law from England, and that meant it was illegal to take wildlife. So it was called the Mountain Men Law, and it was really geared towards this time period of individuals being, you know, fur bearers or coming out and trapping animals and selling their meat or their fur, etc., to you know England or Europe for that matter. And it was really geared at kind of trying to protect beavers, trying to protect large mammals. It had nothing to do with fish at the time. But even, in 1849, people were realizing that with all the amount of trapping that was going on and hunting that was going on, that the wildlife were being decimated in many portions of the western United States. It had already been done in the eastern United States, but the western United States, it was untouched, it was wild places, and we noticed that, hey, we don't want what happened to the eastern part of the United States to occur in the western part of the United States. So you start to see some legislation adopted. In 51, the state of California enacted the very first law dealing with fish and game, and that was to protect elk, antelope, deer, quail, mallards, wood ducks for 6 months out of the year. So it was basically to protect these organisms during their reproductive periods, from about um, February-ish until kind of August, that kind of period of time. They were protected. Okay? And that had a lot to do with wood ducks. Wood duck populations were noted by many individuals as being fairly low after the establishment of of California being a state. So once California became a state and there's more people there, a lot of individuals noticed that there was quite a few less wood ducks in the region. And as you can imagine, this is a male wood duck here. You can see this plumage. They were shot for their feathers. It wasn't People weren't shooting these to eat them, and they weren't really shooting mallards or even quail to eat. They were taking the feathers from these birds and selling the feathers for mainly ladies' hats. That was kind of the big thing in the 1850s, was these extravagant hats that were made out of real feathers. And wood ducks having a very iridescent plumage and different colors, they're a great bird to harvest because you could get all kinds of different feather colors from the wood ducks. In 54, um, the game laws protecting elk and antelope and wood ducks and mallards and quail in the state of California, it moved from just a few counties to every county in the state. And then you start to see that California starts kind of, I guess, what you could consider a wildfire. Okay, so there's a lot of other states that were like, oh, California's protecting their game. We need to protect our game. And so you start to see other counties in neighboring states like Oregon and even in Nevada, Idaho, even into Washington, Arizona, they start protecting places. They start protecting their game. At first, it was just typically large game animals, okay? Elk, deer, that kind of stuff. The first license was started in 1860, okay? And that meant that you could take fish, okay? And basically, this was the first discriminatory license also. So if you were from Asia, or what they said that you were Chinese or Mongolia, you could not apply for the license. But if you were non-Mongolian or non-Chinese, you could take fish with a license. So it's the very first kind of license that was established. Okay? In 61, the state of California started to close seasons for trout, mainly for trout reproduction. So they would close, depending on the species of trout, either the fall or the spring. Whenever they were migrating and spawning, a lot of times they would close the season to provide that protection for the trout species. Okay, in 1870, we see the first board of fish commissioners, and now we start to see, hey, we've already ruined a lot of these rivers and a lot of these streams, either through habitat degradation, which often happened because you have to realize in this region there was a lot of gold mining going on, and so the tailings were just poured back into the streams, which ruined a lot of salmon and trout runs. But on top of that, there was overfishing that was going on. And so the Board of Fish Commissioners started to think about, okay, how are we going to restore these streams? How are we going to preserve the fish that occur in these different streams? And so that was started in 1870. In 71, it became the United States Commission on Fish and Fisheries, which later became known as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So it took, California stepping up to the plate, but like I said, it didn't take very long, maybe 20 years or so, from when California started to regulate organisms, the taking of organisms, that the United States realized, hey, the entire United States should do something, because there's over harvest and stream degradation and deforestation, and a lot of things that were going on, that were harming the fish and wildlife of the United States. And so they started the Commission on Fish and Fisheries. That moved into Fish and Wildlife, and Spencer Bard was their very first commissioner. In 71, so later on in 71, they started to go with wardens. So states got their first wardens. So basically, they established the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then a little bit later on, they realized that, hey, we have to have individuals that are going to carry out our policies, our regulations, etc. So they started the first wardens and started giving states wardens. Not every state got a warden in 1871, but definitely started to develop that. The other thing is like I said before, when we had the doctrine of, hey, how do we restore this? How do we preserve this? At the same time, they started thinking, okay, well, what does Europe have, or what do these other countries have that we would like? Okay, so they started importing fish, and they started with shad. Okay? Mainly because shad had been realized that it was a great bait fish, and areas that had a bunch of shad would increase the size of your fish populations. Maybe, maybe not. May not. It may have not worked all that well in many regions. In 72, instead of importing things, the United States decided, hey, it might be time that we start growing our own. So they started hatcheries and started doing bypasses, fish ladders. So they realized that salmon runs were no longer able to get up to their native grounds. A lot of salmon and trout would pile up behind dams, and so they started to build kind of fish ladders or fish passages around dams to kind of prevent that holding of fish stocks back. Also, the hatchery system started, and we started dumping fish back into the system, mainly starting with trout and salmon, but then moving to warm water species in some regions. Okay, about 30 years later, 1901, we still had issues in the United States with overhunting, with the sale of game species. So there were many laws that were too lenient early on, and so the laws started to become more rigid and started expanding to more things than just protecting elk and a couple fish species. So they started setting bag limits. And in 1901, you had a 3 buck bag limit, a 50 duck and dove limit, and 25 quail. Night hunting was outlawed, and this is especially the case in the western states, so California, etc. In other states, even though it might not have been completely outlawed, it depended on the state for sure. Now, it was the recommendation of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that it be outlawed in 1901, but states at the time still regarded those recommendations as just that, recommendations. So there was night hunting in many regions, and there still is night hunting in many regions in the United States. Okay, but so in 1901, that's where we first start to see night hunting being outlawed in certain places. Okay, 1907 was the very first time that every single person who was going to hunt had to have a hunting license. Okay, it was a single dollar, but everyone had to have one if you're going to take wild game by hunting means. In 1913 is when we start to see the first fishing license, and that was everyone over 18, and again, it was a single dollar. Okay, so there's a resident hunter's license in 1913. You can see, so even though it was established in 07, even in 1913, the hunting license was still just a single dollar. Very reasonable, which is to be expected given that during this time period, a lot of people hunted for food, and that was their means by which they got their protein, and that was it. I mean, it was not like you could go to the grocery store. A lot of people didn't have money to buy food resources and things like that, so they hunted for their food resources. It was not really thought of as a sport at the time. It was thought of as a means to survive. and but to protect the game and fish, licenses were developed to kind of pay for those hatchery programs, also to pay for the um, acquiring of land. So early on, one of the goals was kind of taken from the U.S. Forest Service. So when Pinchot started the Forest Service, his goal was to expand the Forest Service and buy up land for the government. Um, Early on with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that was also part of their policy, is to charge license fees and then utilize some of that money to buy chunks of land and maintain those chunks of land. In 34, you see the first Coordination Act, the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, and that really kind of, I guess you could say, it really established U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a legit entity. So it literally took about 50 years or so before you start to see that people actually recognize fish and wildlife, even though they had game wardens in a lot of states. It's before they actually recognized fish and wildlife as a group ran by the government for the betterment of fish and game. In 40, Fish and Wildlife Service was created. So, like I said before, eventually the council, the Fish and Fisheries Council, becomes the Fish and Wildlife Service. But that name, Fish and Fisheries Council or Committee, it really doesn't do them credit, because it wasn't just fish and fisheries that they were dealing with. They started a lot of the game laws. They opened up hunting licenses and fishing licenses. So they were acting as Fish and Wildlife Service, even though they might have been called something else. But in 1940, under that Coordination Act, now we start to see a lot more money being utilized, or money coming from the Department of Interior. That's where Fish and Wildlife Service sits. And so the government started putting more money into the management of fish and wildlife in the 1940s. So in the early 1940s, a lot of things around wildlife diseases. So you started to see states getting full-time wildlife disease experts. This really came around because a lot of ranching, it started to explode in the 1940s. And so a lot of beef and sheep herds were moving into certain regions, especially in the western United States. With that came diseases, sometimes passed on by wildlife to the domestic organisms, but vice versa often also. And so you started to see these outbreaks in wildlife diseases, and so you had investigators and whatnot in many states that occurred. Okay? And that probably had a lot to do with that ramping up of food resources, probably had a lot to do with we were at war, or going to be at war in some cases, or just finishing war in other cases, and we needed food and whatnot. So in the 1940, and then a little bit later on, you start to see that the nation's bird is finally protected under the Bald Eagle and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Okay, that really didn't necessarily stop people from killing bald eagles or golden eagles, but it did provide a little bit more financial support. It was illegal to kill bald eagles and golden eagles under the Protection Act in 1940, but you still see that occurring, because when you look at eagle populations, they're still decreasing far outside of 1940. In 1962, Rachel Carson published her book called Silent Spring, and Rachel Carson was a marine biologist, but she was an avid birder. And so she watched birds, very meticulous, and took meticulous notes on birds and what birds came to bird feeders, what birds did she see on her walks, etc. And she noticed that bird populations in her lifetime were decreasing and that there were a lot less birds. So, her being kind of a scientist and more of an investigative scientist, she started looking into, well, what's going on? Why are these birds decreasing? And she had to point her finger at DDT, which came out of World War II. DDT was part of the chemical composition of some of the biological weapons or chemical weapons that we were using in World War II. DDT was part of that, um, and but DDT is an excellent insecticide, and so out of wartime, DDT was used as an insecticide constantly to ramp up food production, etc. And it worked. It worked great. It killed all the insects. But it also had a long half life. And so, or it would bioaccumulate. So, organisms that would eat organisms that had been poisoned with DDT would also accumulate DDT in their system. And if the organism lived for a long time, they could accumulate large amounts of DDT in their system. And eventually, what the root cause of it all was that DDT makes it so the products of, or the chemical composition of eggshells don't merge together. They don't bind together. Okay, so DDT will block the binding of certain proteins in the eggshell, and it will cause eggshells to be extremely thin. Sometimes so thin that when the eggshell when a bird wraps the eggshell around the yolk and the embryo, that the eggshell is disintegrated right then. In other cases, it was thick enough that the bird could lay the egg, but then if the bird was to put pressure on it by trying to incubate the egg would shatter, it would crack, and the offspring would die. So in the 1970s, a man named Jim Greer, who I personally know, he was one of the faculty members that I learned ornithology from. He got involved with, first of all, like he knew of Rachel Carson. He knew what Rachel Carson was saying in Silent Spring, and agreed with her from a scientific point of view that something was going on. And like I said before, bald eagle populations were really low. Okay, so if we're looking at basically the time at which Rachel Carson presented or published her Silent Springs, in the entire United States there was 487 pairs of bald eagles. Okay? And so that's the point where we start. Jim Greer got involved here in the 70s and late 60s, and he started examining bald eagle populations. He started examining the effects of DDT on bald eagles and what could be done. So he was an eagle biologist. He was also kind of a whistleblower when it came to DDT and the use of DDT, and he published many publications banning DDT. So the ban of DDT, subsequent recovery of reproduction in bald eagles. So this is a science publication that he noted in 1982 after DDT had been banned in the 70s, that he started to see, hey, eagle populations are coming back. Reproduction is coming back. The eagles are doing much better. And he contributed to the banning of DDT and the non-use of DDT any longer. The shells of the eagles' eggs had hardened, and they're able to bounce back. As of 2006, this is kind of the newest numbers or that I have from Dr. Greer himself. He's retired now, so there are a lot of other people that have kind of picked up his work. But as of 2006, the eagle population in the United States was almost 10,000 breeding pairs in the United States. So this is one of the aspects, one of the Endangered Species Acts, one of the, I guess, poster childs of the Endangered Species Act is that the bald eagle was on the Endangered Species Act, and quite technically it still is on the Endangered Species Act because it's the nation's bird, and it would have been kind of a really big deal if you mess up your country so bad through pollution and the use of insecticides and hunting um, and habitat degradation that your nation bird goes extinct. Right? And so through Carson and Greer and quite a few other biologists, some that I will name later, like Phil Peaster. I'll talk more about Phil Peaster. They started the Endangered Species Act. They got it passed. They got organisms on that Endangered Species Act, and some of them have recovered. Bald eagle is a great example of one that has. But it took a lot of resources, a lot of man hours, and a lot of special individuals to be able to go against big corporations. DDT and the manufacturers of DDT were huge corporations. They were making millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in the 60s on the sale of DDT products. And on top of that, it was working. The amount of grain and uh, farm goods that were coming off of farms had never been higher coming out of World War II, had never been higher with the establishment of DDT. There are still countries today that use DDT as their insecticide. Okay? But we see with the banning of DDT, we can start to see a lot of these bird populations, especially our nation's bird, starts to come back and get reestablished. The other thing about Jim Greer that makes him kind of special, besides that I know him personally very well, is that he was the very first individual to artificially inseminate a bird. Okay, and so this bird right here flying, this is a golden eagle that was Dr. Greer's personal bird or personal pet, I guess you could say. Its name is Ithaca, or was Ithaca. It passed away. But Dr. Greer, when he was young and in grad school, he was trying to increase populations of eagles. He was mainly using golden eagles because it's a lot easier to work with golden eagles. Their numbers were better than bald eagles, and he artificially inseminated the very first pair of golden eagles. And he also artificially inseminated other birds, red-tailed hawks, and etc. But nonetheless, fairly interesting career from an individual. And if you ever get to meet the man, you'll be surprised by how humble he is, even though he's part of the reason why we have bald eagles in the United States. Okay, and a big part of that. So the Endangered Species Act started in 1973, and then the Toxic Substance Control Act, and then Clean Water Act. These were all legislation that was signed in. Majority of them signed in by Richard Nixon as a president. He did a lot of acts that were protecting the environment. So even though he gets, credited as being a horrible president, he actually did a lot for fish and wildlife and forest service and the protection of a lot of the United States lands. And that really came out of Nixon's office. The one that I want to have you guys think about, because this is the one that is most often changed and most often kind of tweaked, and will probably be tweaked for, depending on who the president is, for many years to come. So the Clean Water Act, part of the Clean Water Act says that waters that are navigable are waterways that can be protected. Well, navigable waterways is up to the definition of the individual who's reading it. So, what does it mean to be navigable? Does that mean that have to be able to put like a 14-foot boat in it, a kayak, an inner tube? What is navigable waterways? So that's been up for uh, debate for a very long time. Under Obama, navigable waterways really meant every single waterway that would eventually connect to a waterway that was navigable. So, yes, you can put your boat in the Mississippi, but every single waterway that contributes to the Mississippi is also part of that navigable waterway. There's no disconnect. There's no stopping those waterways. So under Obama, it was navigable waterways meant basically all the water, all the nation's water that flowed into a system that was going to go to the ocean was up for the Clean Water Act. Under the current president, under Trump, navigable waterways is boat-ready waterways, and then even at that, they have to fit a certain size. And so we're protecting about 1/5 of the nation's waterways, and so under Obama, we protected a lot more. Under Trump, we're protecting a lot less. And you'll see probably the next president or a couple presidents down the road might change this Water Act again. And so a lot of these acts are just up for interpretation, or they can be tweaked very easily, and some things can be allowed to slide and other things not so much. So really, I just want you to think about these things when you're learning about the Endangered Species Act or Substance Control Acts or things like that, is that even under the Endangered Species Act, whether or not a species makes it on the Endangered Species Act is up for basically debate. There have been a lot of species that have been tried to be put on the Endangered Species Act and failed. Okay, well, in Obama's presidency, he tried to put sage grouse on the Endangered Species Act, and it was failed. It was shot down. Under Trump's presidency, we're starting to see things be removed from the Endangered Species Act. So it's being blocked in the courts right now, but grizzly bears are one of those organisms that are under the current presidency should be removed from the Endangered Species Act, but we have courts and judges involved saying that, this needs to be blocked or whatnot. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about hunting seasons and things like that. But just realize that there are situations where species and the acts that protect them or protect their habitat are up for debate. It's not likely that you can get one removed. It's not likely that you can take the Clean Water Act and remove it altogether, or that a president would ever do that. But the interpretation of that act is up to the president or up to the president's cabinet or whoever's in charge of that Department of Interior at the time. Okay. So management today, what's going on today? It depends on where you're at. Okay. Wolves in many regions of the United States are now a huntable species, at least have a a season, and so you'll start to see that some regions uh, they boycott these things. People boycott these things. Other regions, they're all for it. We have states that will open up seasons, even though organisms are maybe on the endangered species list or threatened species list or something like that. But in the given state, maybe their populations are high enough that they think that a season is warranted. And that's kind of what's going on with Wyoming and grizzly bears. There's a lot of corporations that do not want to see Wyoming start a hunting season on grizzly bears. Wyoming does have a hunting season on wolves. And so you'll start to see that courts get involved, lawyers get involved, legislators get involved, and ultimately it's often just the interpretation of the current laws or who is currently in office, how they interpret things, whether or not something's going to happen. So even though maybe you can wrap something up in a court and you can take a lawsuit and you can prevent the hunting season for 1 year, eventually what often will occur is the next year it'll probably take place. So then maybe there's a shift of the guard and you have a different president, maybe a different party, or maybe the same party but doesn't agree with the previous um, administration's interpretations of those acts and reinstates, different things. So there's a lot of situations that are going on, okay, including in management today, the not just the management of resources within a given state or within your country, but now the management of resources in the world. Okay, so again, you guys have been reading the book Cod, and you realize, hey, look, no one owns the ocean. Now, some people think they do, and world powers will definitely try to show their muscle and utilize more of the ocean than maybe they should and abuse the ocean more than they should. But nonetheless, when we're talking about fish and wildlife management, it's not just what it set out to be early on, and that's protecting a single county in California. It moved from that to protecting all the counties in California, to protecting all the states, and now, in many cases, if the organism crosses borders, then it's to protect that organism no matter where it is in the world. Okay? And that's the job of fish and game in many aspects, especially if you're a bordering state, if you're on the coasts or if you're on the borders of different countries. Your job is to reflect management across those borders because animals and even fish, they don't recognize a border. They don't stop at the border and say, oh, if I go that way, that's Canada, and now I'm now I can be caught and consumed. It's not like that. So uh, fishing, wildlife, and game management has to be a lot more global now than it ever was, and that will continue um, for a long period of time. The other thing that we start to see is because there's multiple entities now, and so you have Fish and Wildlife, and you also have the U.S. Forest Service. Um, there's a lot of, I don't want to say butting of heads, but sometimes there is butting of heads, but there's also a lot of collaboration that needs to go on. So, especially when it came to things like spotted owl situation. So, for the spotted owl situation, um, the owl itself was protected under the Endangered Species Act. Okay? But at the time, the habitat of the owl was thought to only be something like old growth. Right? And so if spotted owls only occurred in old growth, then the only trees that should be protected were old growth forests. Okay? Not secondary growth, nothing like that. Okay, just old growth, natural growth forest. Well, in many states, that was not the case. Spotted owl didn't recognize, oh, this is old growth stand, oh, and this is secondary growth stand. Spotted owl was going wherever the flying squirrel was going, and if the flying squirrel was able to establish itself in secondary growth, then the spotted owl was going to go there because that's his main food source. Okay? Well, Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, got involved because their goal is to protect habitat. So, you have cartoonists that say, well, the timber industry wants to bury the spotted owl. They want to dig a grave and they don't care about spotted owls whatsoever. The U.S. Forest Service wants to protect little pockets of land, allow every piece of land around it to be clear cut. And so basically you're putting this bird in a cage, and Mother Nature wants it to be unscathed and untouched. So the reason why I bring this up is Game and Fish has to get involved also, because clearly Game and Fish can't allow for the spotted owl to go extinct. U.S. Forest Service can't allow for no harvesting of trees, otherwise they don't exist anymore. And so, yes, somewhere in the middle here, it may look like a cage. It may look like you got these little pockets that are protected. And we now have management practices that are better than that. But in the 80s, that's exactly what was going on. Circles of habitat were being protected, and the rest of it was being cut. And so, again, this is just a point that now you have multiple entities, not just Game and Fish, not just Forest Service, but you have BLM, you have the Bureau of Management, okay, if there's a waterway that's involved, you have private owners that want to protect and private owners that don't want to protect, corporate owners, you have a whole bunch of players, and often you'll have a wildlife species or a fish that's kind of stuck in between. I'll give you some more examples of this as we go. Okay, so what do you need to be a game and fish manager or game and fish biologist? Okay, well, it depends on it depends on what you want to do for the game and fish or fish and wildlife management. If you want to be a fish and wildlife biologist, a wildlife refuge manager, a fisheries biologist, wildlife inspector, USDA, there's lots and lots of jobs out there for individuals who are interested. I'm guessing since you're taking this course that you're somewhat interested in the process of being, part of fish and wildlife or game and fish. For the most part, you need a 4-year degree in some related field to biology. That could be biological sciences, agriculture, natural resource management, chemistry. It depends, again, on what entity you want to belong to and what kind of job you want to get into. That will get your foot in the door in many cases at a very low level, a 4-year degree. Most positions with game and fish or fish and wildlife, they prefer a master's degree in one of the fields or 2 years of experience. So you can be an intern or you can work at a lower level for 2 years as kind of a seasonal employee, or maybe even for longer than 2 years, depending on what your season is like. And that might be able to get your foot in the door to get a permanent job. So again, it really depends on what agency you want to work for. If you want to work for the wildlife agency and you want to be a wildlife biologist, Then courses in things like mammalogy, ornithology. These are probably courses. It depends if you're interested in non-game, maybe herpetology. These are courses that you would take for wildlife. If you're looking at, fisheries portion, maybe you're interested in ichthyology or entomology, so limnology. There's lots of courses that would be kind of geared towards each group. And the nice thing is with a job in game and fish, is that often, let's say you start off in the fisheries unit, you have an opportunity to move to the wildlife unit. And you don't have to really go back to school and take a bunch of courses to move to the wildlife or vice versa. Often they'll allow you to move between the units. You have to apply and they have to accept you, and they'll train you up on what you need to know. But you have that ability to move and shift. In many states, that's the case. So what are we looking at money wise? So game and fish with a master's degree, you're looking at about 53,000 a year. Now you have to realize this is kind of in the ballpark of take home pay. Okay, this is not counting benefits and things like that. They often have very good health benefits, retirement, etc. Um, Game warden is often a little bit less in most states. Now, again, this depends on the state. So some states it's a lot more than this, but your cost of living is a lot more. So this is just on average. A wildlife biologist for USDA, about 46. Rangeland manager for BLM, 44. If you work for the EPA, a little bit more, 60. Forester, about 46. Fire manager, about 52. And if you're a faculty member, in the realm of fish and wildlife, you're making about 48. Now, the one caveat that I have to talk about as a faculty member, this is for a master's degree, and this is 9 months. Okay, the rest of these are all 12 months. Okay, this is a 9-month salary. So you might often see individuals that get into fish and wildlife, etc., and then instead of working for the state or the government, they switch and they work for a institution as a faculty member. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so the money's okay. Okay? Most of you would look at it and say, hey, if you're making 10,000 a year right now, 50 sounds pretty darn good. But if you know if you're working in the mines and you're making 50, 60 now, with a high school diploma, then going to school for 6 years and making 50,000 might not be the idea that you thought it would be. The one thing that I can definitely say is being a fish and wildlife manager or working for fish and wildlife, it's very different than working for, say, a mining corporation, an oil field, something like that. The job, I don't want to say that mining and whatnot is not not a job that's super rewarding, but bringing species back from extinction, restoring habitat, seeing real world change, could be a lot more rewarding than digging coal out of the ground or you know working in the oil field or whatnot. So I'm not trying to put any of those jobs down. They're definitely needed. But if your goal is to see kind of real world changes and you want to work with wild organisms, wild mammals or birds or fish, etc., then sometimes you have to give a little bit of money up to be able to do that. Okay, so that's kind of the history that I want to talk about. Again, like I said before, we will talk more about specific biologists, specific individuals as we progress a little bit further. I'll talk about Phil Peasters. So, Phil, I know Phil personally, but he's the only person that I know and he might be the only person in the world to single-handedly save a species by himself. Okay, he saved a pupfish known as the Owens pupfish in 2 5-gallon buckets. He saved the entire species by himself. So, and he had been working for Fish and Wildlife or Game and Fish in California. I don't know, for 30, 40 years easily. He had been working for them, and so we'll talk about that story, and I'll share kind of his notes on that in something that he wrote for Nature called "A Species in the Bucket." But we'll talk about his management style and what he did when he was a manager for California, for the state of California, and and what he would say some of his major blunders were as a manager, and that he learned from these, much like Aldo Leopold learned from his early policies on, if it's a predator, kill it. The same thing kind of that Phil Peaster learned was, hey, just because you have fish doesn't mean that you should stock them. Okay, so we'll come back and we'll talk more about that. And then, like I said before, once the semester is at midterm, after that, we're going to practice and you'll learn a lot of techniques geared towards fish and wildlife management.